"You're overreacting, he's just a coworker," my wife repeated every time I asked questions. I stopped asking and started preparing instead. When the papers were served at work, her confidence disappeared faster than any explanation she had ready. "You're overreacting. He's just a coworker." That was the third time she'd said it in 2 weeks. Same words, same calm voice, same slight tilt of the head, like she was explaining something obvious to someone a little slow. I didn't say anything back that night. Not because I had nothing to say, but because something in the way she said it, too practiced, too smooth, made me realize that arguing wasn't going to be the move. I didn't know it yet, but that night was the last time I'd ever ask her anything about him. What I did instead changed everything. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. We were 34 and 32, married 6 years, no kids, a decision we'd revisited every couple of years without landing anywhere. We lived in a decent house in a decent suburb, had 2 decent cars, and a marriage that I'd have described, until about 4 months before all of this, as quietly good. Not perfect, but good. That's the part that stings the most when you look back. Her name is Claudette. She works in corporate communications for a mid-sized logistics firm, one of those companies that ships industrial equipment across the country and has a surprisingly large PR budget. She'd taken the job about 18 months before any of this happened. Better title, better pay, longer commute. I supported the move completely. I do project management for a construction consultancy. Different worlds, same highway. For the first year at the new job, everything was fine. Then she started coming home later. Not dramatically late, not the kind of late that sets off alarms on its own. 30 minutes here, an hour there. A Tuesday where dinner became a reheated thing at 9:30 instead of a cooked thing at 7. She always had an explanation. The explanations were always reasonable. That's the thing about the early stage. Everything is technically explainable. His name came up the first time in passing. We were in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, and she was telling me about a campaign her team was putting together, something about rebranding the company's shipping infrastructure as sustainable logistics, and she mentioned him. Colton. Colton had this idea about framing it around carbon offset partnerships, she said, stirring something on the stove. It's actually pretty smart. I nodded, asked a vague question, filed the name somewhere in the back of my head. Didn't think much of it. But the name came up again, and again, and again. Colton thought this. Colton suggested that. Colton and I stayed late to finish the deck. Colton's taking the lead on the new client pitch. It wasn't the frequency that started to bother me. It was the texture of how she said his name. There's a difference between how someone talks about a colleague and how someone talks about a person they find interesting. I can't explain it better than that. It's a softness, a slight forward lean when the name comes out, a pause after it, like the word is worth tasting. I noticed. I didn't say anything, but I noticed. The first time I actually asked, it was low-key. Curious, not accusatory. We were watching something on TV and she mentioned him again. Something about how he'd handled a difficult client call, and I said, "You talk about him a lot. What's his deal?" "He's a coworker," she said, eyes still on the screen. "He's good at his job." "How old is he?" "I don't know. 28, 29. "Is he single?" That's when she looked at me. Not angry, not defensive, just tired looking. The way someone looks when they think a conversation beneath them is beginning. I don't keep track of my coworkers' relationship statuses. I'm just asking. I know what you're doing. What am I doing? She turned back to the TV. Being insecure. That word landed differently than she probably intended. Not because it hurt, but because it was a deflection disguised as a diagnosis. She hadn't answered the question. She'd redirected it into a comment about my character. I let it go that night, but I started paying attention differently after that. There are things you notice when you start looking. Small things, individually meaningless. Together, a pattern. She started caring more about what she wore to work. Not dramatically. She'd always dressed professionally, but there was a new deliberateness to it. Time in front of the mirror went up. A few new items appeared in the closet that she hadn't mentioned buying. Her phone, which had always lived on the kitchen counter or the coffee table in the evenings, migrated to her person. Always face down. Always nearby. She laughed more at her phone than she used to. Not at shows. Not at things she was reading. At messages. And when I'd glance over, not snooping, just the natural glance you give a person you live with, she'd tilt the screen away just slightly. Just slightly. The kind of adjustment that comes from habit. The second time I asked, it didn't go well. We were in the car, driving back from dinner with her sister, and she mentioned that Colton had covered for her in a meeting that afternoon when she'd stepped out for a call. "He really has my back," she said. "That's a lot of trust to put in a coworker," I said. "He's a good colleague. You talk about him like he's more than that." She went quiet for a moment. Then, "You're doing this again." "I'm asking a question." "You're accusing." "I'm asking a question about a person whose name comes up in our house more often than my own brother's." She shifted in the seat. "That's not fair." "Which part?" "He's a coworker. That's it. We work on the same team." "I don't know what you want me to say. That I'll stop mentioning people I work with? Should I just stop talking about work entirely so you feel better?" I didn't respond. She took my silence as a retreat. But it wasn't a retreat. It was a decision. I stopped asking after that. Not because she'd convinced me. Not even close. But because I understood, in that car ride home, that asking wasn't going to get me anywhere. She'd built a wall around this particular subject, smooth on all sides, nothing to grip. Every question became evidence of my insecurity. Every concern became proof that I was the problem. So I stopped asking, and I started watching. I want to be honest about this next part, because I've told this story to a few people and the reaction is always split. Some people say what I did was cold, calculated, that I should have pushed harder, or gone to couples therapy, or demanded honesty before I took the steps I took. Maybe. But here's what they don't understand. I had pushed. Gently. Twice. And both times, she hadn't just denied it. She'd turned it around on me. Made me feel like the suspicious husband was the villain of the story. Like my instincts were a character flaw. So no, I didn't push a third time. I paid attention instead. I started noticing her schedule in a way I never had before. Not obsessively. Not in a way that consumed me. But deliberately. I knew what time she usually left. I knew what time she usually got home. I started noting the gaps. There were gaps. A Thursday where she said she'd stayed for a team dinner, but her sister texted me asking if we were free that night, and mentioned she'd tried Claudette and got no answer. Later I found out that team dinner had been 2 people. Her and Colton. She didn't lie about it exactly. She just didn't mention that detail. A Friday afternoon where she said traffic had been terrible, and it genuinely had been. So I couldn't even call that one a lie. But she'd texted me from a location that wasn't on her usual route home. I knew the area. There were 2 restaurants and a wine bar on that block. I didn't bring any of it up. I just logged it. And then, about 6 weeks into this new way of paying attention, I made a decision. I called an attorney. I know that sounds like a jump. Let me explain why it wasn't. I wasn't going in to file papers that day. I wasn't certain about anything. What I wanted was information. I wanted to understand what my position would be, what steps I'd need to take, what evidence, if any, actually mattered in a no-fault state. I wanted to know what preparing looked like before I needed it. The attorney, a woman named Margaret who came recommended by a colleague going through his own divorce, spent about 45 minutes with me. She was matter-of-fact in a way I found calming. She told me what to document, what not to do, what to avoid saying, what to protect financially. She also told me that in her experience, by the time a spouse comes in asking these questions, the marriage is usually already over. The person just hasn't admitted it yet. I drove home that evening thinking she was probably right. The shift happened on a Wednesday night in November. Claudette came home later than usual, close to 9, with the slightly flushed energy that I'd come to associate with the evenings she spent with him. Not drunk, not disheveled, just lit up, like someone who'd been laughing a lot had walked into a quiet house and was doing a poor job of turning the volume down. "Good night," I asked. "Neutral. Long day," she said, setting her bag down. "You ate already?" "We ordered in at the office." She paused. "Some of us were working late. Some of us." The phrase landed like a small stone. "I made tea." She showered. We watched 40 minutes of something neither of us was paying attention to and went to bed. I lay there in the dark for a long time that night. And I thought very clearly, this is not going to fix itself. There was one more moment that matters before the end. I came home early on a Friday. A meeting had been canceled, and her laptop was open on the kitchen table. She was upstairs. The screen was still on. I wasn't going to look. I really wasn't. But I walked past, and the preview notification at the top of the screen was visible without touching anything. Visible from standing distance. A message notification from an app one didn't recognize. Not her work email, not her regular text thread. The preview showed 3 words before the screen timed out. 3 words. "Miss you already." I didn't touch the laptop. Didn't open anything. Didn't take a photo. I just stood there for a moment, and then I went to the fridge and poured a glass of water and stood at the window looking at the backyard. And I thought, there it is. Not the explosion I'd expected to feel. Not rage. Not devastation. Just a quiet, cold settling, like something that had been uncertain had finally decided. I called Margaret the next morning. The process took longer than I expected. Almost 2 months from that call to the day the papers were ready. There were financial accounts to organize. I'd already started being methodical about this, partly on Margaret's advice, and documentation to compile, and a conversation with my company's HR about some joint accounts we had tied to my benefits. Claudette didn't notice any of it. Or if she did, she didn't say anything. That was the part one kept thinking about in those 2 months. She had no idea. We were living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, eating dinner together some nights, watching television. This entire semblance of a marriage. And she genuinely had no idea that I had already started the machinery that would end it. She thought I'd asked my questions, been shut down, and gone quiet. She thought the quiet was surrender. The decision to serve the papers at her workplace was not petty. I want to address that directly because I know how it sounds. It wasn't designed for humiliation. It was designed for certainty. Margaret had advised me that serving at home, without a witness, in a private setting, had risks if Claudette chose to dispute service or create a scene and later claim something that hadn't happened. Serving at work, through a professional process server, created a clean, documented record. A witness. A precise timestamp. No ambiguity. That was the reason. What I did not anticipate, what I genuinely could not have predicted, was the specific way it unfolded. I found out afterward, through a detail I won't explain except to say it reached me through a mutual contact. The process server arrived at her office building on a Thursday afternoon at around 2:30. Claudette was in the middle of a meeting. She was, according to what I was told, sitting at a conference table with her team, which included Colton. She was called out of the meeting, told there was someone in the lobby with a delivery requiring a signature. She walked out casually. She signed. She looked at the envelope. She read the return address. She went back into the conference room. And then she sat down in a room full of her colleagues. The people she'd been performing normalcy with for 18 months, the people she'd been careful around, the people who perhaps knew more than she realized. And she stared at the table. Someone, apparently, asked if she was okay. She didn't answer. She called me 4 minutes later. I was sitting in my car in a parking garage outside my office. I'd taken the afternoon off. I knew roughly when service would happen, and I didn't want to be in a meeting when my phone rang. I answered. "What did you do?" she said. Not a question. "I filed for divorce." Silence. "Why didn't you? You didn't even talk to me." "I talked to you," I said. 3 times. You told me I was overreacting. That was about Colton. You're filing for divorce over a coworker? I'm filing for divorce over 6 months of being lied to and made to feel like I was losing my mind. I never lied to you. I know about the other app. Another silence. Longer this time. How? The notification was visible on your screen. 3 words. You were upstairs. I didn't touch anything. She didn't say anything for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The calm, practiced quality was gone. What replaced it wasn't grief exactly. More like disorientation. The sound of someone who'd been walking confidently through a room and stepped on a patch of ice. "This is extreme," she finally said. "This is an extreme reaction. You've been telling me I overreact for months," I said. I stopped reacting. I started thinking. This is what I thought. She came home that night. I was already there. I'd made dinner for one, which I acknowledged was a little theatrical, but I was running on 4 hours of sleep and raw nerves, and cooking had been automatic. She walked in and stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked, and I say this without satisfaction, wrecked. Not crying, but somewhere right before it. Her work composure stripped entirely. "I need you to explain this to me," she said. "I think you understand it. You're ending a 6-year marriage because of suspicion. I'm ending a 6-year marriage because I watched my wife check out of it, lie to me by omission for months, and then make me feel like I was unhinged every time I noticed." Nothing happened. I looked at her. "Nothing happened," she said again, with a force that I think was meant to be convincing. "Then you'll have a lot of time to reflect on why that didn't matter." She asked, over the following days, to do counseling. She asked me to pause the filing. She wanted to explain, really explain, she said, for the first time, what had actually been happening with Colton, with her job, with herself. I agreed to the conversation. Not to reconciliation, but to the conversation. And what she told me was, I'll admit, more complicated than I'd fully understood. She hadn't had a physical affair. She was insistent about that, and I believe her, partly because of what I knew, partly because of the timeline. What she described instead was something she called an emotional entanglement, and she used that word with a kind of self-awareness that told me she'd been thinking about it in those terms for a while. She'd found Colton interesting in a way she hadn't found me in years. That was the truth she led with, because I think she knew a gentle version wouldn't reach me anymore. He was ambitious and quick-thinking, and there was an energy at work that she'd been missing at home. She said she hadn't gone looking for it. She said she'd been trying to manage it. She said she knew it had gone too far when she'd started structuring her day around the moments she'd see him. She said she was ashamed of it. She said she'd been hoping it would burn itself out. She said she was sorry. I listened to all of it. Here's where I'll be honest about the part that people sometimes misread. I didn't file those papers because I was angry. I filed them because of something I'd slowly understood over those 2 months of preparation. Something that snapped into focus when I read Margaret's notes the night before service. I had spent 6 months being managed. My instincts, which were correct, had been used against me. My concern had been reframed as weakness. My questions had been treated as accusations and turned back on me until I went quiet. And the only reason I had gone quiet was because I'd chosen a different approach, not because I'd been convinced. But the silence had been read as defeat. And she'd kept going. That's not a marriage. That's a dynamic. And once you see the dynamic clearly, you can't unsee it. I won't dress up the aftermath with false resolution. The divorce took 7 months to finalize. Relatively uncomplicated, given the circumstances, no children, a shared mortgage that got handled through a buyout she proposed and I accepted. There were lawyers. There were signatures. There were evenings I sat in the house we'd shared and felt something much heavier than anger. Anger, at least, is energizing. Grief just sits there. I grieve the marriage. I grieve the version of her I'd married. I grieve the quieter life we'd been building. The future that had been real and specific and now wasn't. That grief was legitimate. I let it be legitimate. I didn't rush it. She moved out in the spring. She did not stay at the company. I found out, through someone we'd both known for years, that she'd taken a new position at a different firm, better title, different city. Something she'd apparently been considering anyway. Colton, as far as I knew, remained at the original company. I don't know what happened there. I didn't ask. By that point, it wasn't my information to have. There's a moment I keep coming back to. It's not the kitchen table with the notification. It's not the car conversation. It's not even the service. It's a Tuesday night, maybe 3 weeks before I called Margaret the second time. We were making dinner together. One of those domestic, surface normal evenings that had become strangely common in those months. She was slicing something. I was doing something at the stove. Familiar music was on. And I looked at her and felt nothing. Not anger. Not longing. Not even sadness, exactly. Just absence. Like looking at a piece of furniture in a room you're about to leave. I think that was the moment I knew, more than any evidence, more than any notification. That moment of ordinary absence. People ask me, sometimes, whether I regret how I handled it. Whether I should have confronted her with what I knew, directly, and given her the chance to come clean before I started a legal process. And my answer is always the same. She had 3 chances to come clean. 3 separate conversations where I asked, directly, what was happening. 3 times she chose, "You're overreacting," over the truth. She had 6 months to choose differently. She chose, every single time, to keep the situation intact at the cost of my perception of reality. The legal process wasn't a punishment. It was just me, finally, making a choice with the same clarity she'd been operating from all along. The last time I saw her in person was at the final document signing. A windowless conference room. 2 attorneys. A notary. Coffee that neither of us touched. She looked tired. Contained. Professional. She'd always known how to be professional. At one point, while waiting for something to be printed, she looked at me across the table and said, quietly, "I didn't think you'd actually do it." It was the most honest thing she'd said in almost a year. "I know," I said. "I thought you'd keep asking. And I'd keep explaining. And we'd just..." She didn't finish the sentence. "Yeah," I said. "I know." That was it. No dramatic confrontation. No final argument. No catharsis built for an audience. Just 2 people in a quiet room, finishing what had already been finished long before the paperwork made it real. I live alone now. It's been 14 months. I cook more than I used to. I've gotten mildly obsessive about one specific genre of woodworking. Nothing serious, just something to do with my hands on weekends. I talk to my brother more. I sleep better, which surprised me, and maybe shouldn't have. I don't consider myself a cautionary tale. I don't consider myself vindicated. I don't walk around with a clear moral to offer anyone who asks. What I have is this. When someone tells you that your instincts are wrong, not gently, not once, but consistently, as a strategy, they're not correcting you. They're protecting something. And what they're protecting is worth paying attention to. She was confident, right up until the moment she was handed an envelope in a conference room full of her colleagues. And then the confidence went somewhere. Took every prepared explanation with it. Left just the silence. The same silence she'd handed me, over and over, when I asked questions she didn't want to answer. Funny how that works.